So, the first time I attended a seminar in a humanities department many, many years ago, and I was stunned when the seminar speaker sat down and started reading word for word from his published paper, with all of the subordinate clauses and complicated grammatical constructions. And I was appalled that somebody who could supposedly be an expert about language could be so ignorant about the difference between written language and spoken language. And I thought, if a physicist or a mathematician tried to do that, they'd have eggs thrown at them. Well, guess what? In my second career, I've started reading my talks. I think it's partly because I've come to appreciate the importance of the nuance of particular words. And I think partly because there's just no way that I could remember all the ideas that I want to say to give an extemporaneous 1-hour talk. And I'm very, very impressed at, the history professors who could just do that. But I can't. So I want to apologize in advance for reading. I hope that it won't be full of subordinate clauses. And I hope that the mathematicians have not brought eggs. So here I go. Anyway, so what I want to start, the title is very general, Science and Ideology, and you'll see pretty quickly what I mean by that, what I want to talk about. But let me start by giving some very general, and I should stress, fairly traditional observations about the nature of the scientific enterprise. So science, and that includes both the natural and the social sciences, is, or at least is supposed to be, a truth-seeking enterprise. Now, the phenomena that one decides to study might be chosen for their conceptual significance, for their social or economic importance, or simply out of personal curiosity. But whatever topic a scientist decides to investigate, she's intellectually and morally obliged to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even or especially if that evidence conflicts with her preconceptions or her desires. Now, science doesn't always work that way, of course. I mean, scientists are human. But that's anyway the ideal towards which we strive. And if there's freedom of debate within the scientific community, so freedom to hold each other's ideas to stringent conceptual and empirical scrutiny, then the scientific community collectively is more likely to reach objectively true conclusions than any of its members could do alone. Now, a scientist's political and social values may influence her selection of topics to study. That's perfectly legitimate. But those values should be carefully put to the side when evaluating the evidence. The goal of the scientific endeavor is to find out how things really are, not to confirm how we wish they were. Many decisions that we must make collectively about anything from educational methods to pandemics to climate change need to be based on scientific knowledge. We require detailed factual evidence about how children learn to read, how viruses spread, and how the Earth's oceans and atmosphere behave. But although this scientific information forms the essential background for public policy, it doesn't determine that policy, since policy decisions also involve values and trade-offs between competing values. But whatever your values, it still behooves you to have as accurate an understanding as possible about reality to inform your policy choices. Because if you don't, you risk implementing policies that are counterproductive as assessed by your own values. And in a democracy, every citizen has the right and should have the opportunity to do the same. Okay, one important social mechanism within science is peer review. Proposed scientific contributions are evaluated for their correctness and importance by experts in the field, ideally double-blind. And depending on that evaluation, the article may be accepted for publication, accepted subject to revision, or rejected entirely. That system isn't perfect. It can be compromised by personal rivalries, competing research programs, and simple reviewer sloppiness. But it's the best that we've been able thus far to devise. The key desideratum is that submissions should be evaluated for their conceptual rigor, their methodological soundness, their empirical thoroughness, and their importance to the scientific field. Social and political values may play a role in this last aspect, telling us what topics are the most important to investigate. But they should play no role in the evaluation of which contributions on that subject are fit to publish. That evaluation should be based solely on the scientific quality of the research, not on whether we find its results congenial. This, anyway, has been the official policy of the scientific community for the past 3 centuries, implemented imperfectly, to be sure, but nevertheless functioning as an important regulative ideal. But times have changed. Now ideology threatens openly to corrupt the truth-seeking enterprise that we call science. And in this talk, I'd like to give some examples of how. But first, I think it may be useful to step back 30 years into the past and recall some now ancient history. In the mid-1990s, the so-called science wars, well, that's an unfortunate military metaphor applied to what is, after all, an intellectual debate. Anyway, the science wars pitted 2 contrasting points of view about the nature of scientific knowledge. For brevity, let me somewhat oversimplify and say that on one side, a motley crew of postmodernist-influenced literary scholars and social scientists, often, but not always, of a leftist and feminist political bent, espoused an extreme social constructivist view of science and scientific knowledge. And by the way, I can provide some precise quotations from their writings if you worry that I'm exaggerating. On the other side, another motley crew of scientists and philosophers, plus some humanities scholars, historians, and social scientists, from across the whole political spectrum, defended traditional notions of rationality and objectivity, like the ones I've mentioned, at least as ideals towards which to strive. Now, some leftist scientists, it's true, such as Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, did advocate social constructivist theses with regard to particular and highly controversial items of scientific study, notably human intelligence. And some feminist scientists, such as Ruth Hubbard and Evelyn Fox Keller, did the same with regard to other corners of biology and psychology. But no prominent scientist, as far as I know, endorsed the radical view advocated by some sociologists and literary scholars that all purported scientific knowledge, from neutrino physics to organometallic chemistry to lepidopterology, I think that's the study of butterflies, is deeply imbued with social ideology. Nor did any notable scientists advocate social constructivism with respect to long established and uncontroversial items of scientific knowledge, such as the atomic theory of matter or the double helix structure of DNA. That, alas, has changed, at least on certain subjects, and maybe you can guess which ones. Well, one classic of the earlier era was sociologist Andrew Pickering's book, Constructing Quarks, perhaps ominously published in the year 1984. That book provided a superb and extraordinarily detailed history of modern elementary particle physics, sandwiched between initial and final chapters of, well, let me be blunt about my view, astonishingly poor philosophy. On the basis of that philosophy, Pickering concluded that, quote, there is no obligation upon anyone framing a view of the world to take account of what 20th century science has to say. Worldviews are cultural products. There's no need to be intimidated by them. Dare I say that this is grossly misguided? Of course, our ideas about quarks are a human historical and social construction. That's a truism. But there's good reason to believe that the quarks themselves have existed ever since the Big Bang, roughly 13.7 billion years ago. But the reasons justifying that belief are subtle. Quarks are not, after all, directly observable. Neither, of course, are dinosaurs. All we can observe are their fossils. But dinosaurs are, or rather were, mid-sized macroscopic objects, and we can easily imagine what they looked and behaved like by analogy with contemporary animals that we're able to observe today. So we certainly have good reason to believe that there existed, at some time in the past, roughly 240 to 65 million years ago, the animals that we call dinosaurs. Subatomic particles like quarks, by contrast, are very far from our everyday experience, and their behavior is extraordinarily strange. Quantum mechanics was invented by Schrödinger and Heisenberg in 1925. Next year will be the centenary. But no one today, I think, really understands what quantum mechanics is telling us about the fundamental nature of the universe. Let me put this in the first person. I've been studying quantum mechanics for slightly over half that century, and the more I learn about it, the less I understand. And yet, quantum electrodynamics can predict the magnetic moment of the electron to 11 decimal places accuracy. That's equivalent to measuring the distance from Los Angeles to New York to within the width of a human hair, as Nobel laureate Richard Feynman memorably put it. Quarks are, in fact, even more subtle than electrons. Electrons are too small to be directly seen, but at least we can observe their tracks in bubble chambers. But our best contemporary theories tell us that free quarks cannot exist. They're always bound within other elementary particles, such as protons and neutrons. So their existence and behavior has to be inferred by a complicated chain of reasoning involving both experiment and theory. The general outlines of that reasoning can be explained to the lay reader, but the details require advanced mathematics and a deep knowledge of physics. And even at a general level, it is quite subtle. Okay, fast forward 4 decades. Now, the entire American medical establishment, from the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics to the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association, and even the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, insists that sex, as in male or female, is, in the AAP's words, an assignment that is made at birth. What on earth could this possibly mean? I mean, the facts about sex are straightforward, much more straightforward than the facts about quarks. And they're taught in any half-decent high school course in biology. Nearly all animals, as well as many plants, reproduce sexually. In almost all sexually reproducing multicellular species, this occurs by combining a large gamete called an ovum or egg with a small gamete called a sperm. Though some hermaphrodite plants and animals do produce both ova and sperm, there are no hermaphrodite mammalian species. In mammals, each individual produces only one kind of gamete. Those individuals that produce relatively few ova are called female. Those that produce large numbers of sperm are called male. Whether a mammal embryo develops into a male or female is determined, at least when things go right, which is nearly all the time, by a pair of sex chromosomes, XX for females, XY for males. I mean, I think the last time I studied this was 50 years ago in high school biology, but you all know this, right? In short, sex in all animals is defined by gamete size. Sex in all mammals is determined by sex chromosomes. And there are 2 and only 2 sexes, female and male, because there are 2 and only 2 types of gametes, ova and sperm. Now, for sure, quirks of mutation or prenatal development may leave some individuals unable to produce viable gametes at all. But an infertile individual with a Y chromosome is still male, just as a person with 1 leg remains a full member of our bipedal species. Also, much is speciously made of the fact that a very few humans are born with chromosomal patterns other than XX and XY. That's true. The most common Klinefelter syndrome, which is XXY, occurs in about 0.1% of live births. These individuals are anatomically male, though often infertile. Some extremely rare conditions, such as de la Chapelle syndrome, which is 0.003%, and Swyer syndrome, which is 0.0005%, arguably fall outside the standard male-female classification. Even so, the sexual divide is an exceedingly clear binary, as binary as any distinction you can find in biology. So where does this leave the Medical Association's claims about sex assigned at birth? Well, a baby's name is assigned at birth. No one doubts that. But a baby's sex is not assigned. It's determined at conception and is then observed at birth, first by examination of the external genital organs, and then, in cases of doubt, by chromosomal analysis. Now, let me make an interesting side remark. My UCL colleague, Alice Sullivan, drew my attention to very interesting data, which you can find on, what is it called, the World in Data website, showing the sex ratio at birth in various countries since 1950. In several countries, mostly in Asia and Central Asia, there's been, starting in the mid-1980s, a huge preponderance of boys over girls, reaching a peak ratio of 118 to 100 in China in 2005. That's incredible. It's now decreased to 112. And the obvious cause of this disparity is the cultural preference for boys, combined with the availability of sex-selective abortion. And sex-selective abortion is possible precisely because sex is determined at conception and is observable in utero well before it can be assigned at birth. Indeed, aborted fetuses, which are never born, also have a sex, in some countries preferentially female. Of course, just because sex is observed at birth doesn't mean that the observation is always correct. Indeed, any observation can be erroneous. That's a fundamental principle of science. And in very rare cases, the sex reported on the birth certificate is inaccurate and needs to be subsequently corrected. But the fallibility of observation doesn't change the fact that what's being observed, a person's sex, is an objective biological reality, just like their blood group or fingerprint pattern, not something that's assigned. The medical association's pronouncements are social constructivism gone amok, this time about a subject that has been more or less accurately understood by humans, albeit without all the scientific details, ever since the beginning of our species. Sex, unlike quarks, is not subtle. So let's go back to the Medical Association's dogma. What could possibly have impelled sober-minded scientists to advocate such a bizarre and easily refutable view? Well, the cause is evidently political. The medical establishment's newfound reluctance to speak honestly about biological reality, and I have to say its insouciance in speaking dishonestly about it, presumably stems from a laudable desire to defend the human rights of transgender people. But while the goal is praiseworthy, the chosen method is misguided. Protecting transgender people from discrimination and harassment does not require pretending that sex is merely assigned. The bottom line, I think, is this. It's never justified to distort the facts in the service of a social or political cause, no matter how just. If the cause is truly just, then it can be defended in full acceptance of the facts about the real world. If that cannot be done, then the cause is not just. And when an organization that proclaims itself scientific distorts the scientific facts in the service of a social cause, it undermines not only its own credibility, but that of science generally. How can the public be expected to trust the medical establishment's declarations on other controversial issues, such as vaccines, issues on which the medical consensus is indeed right, when it has so visibly and blatantly misstated the facts about something so simple as sex? Now, one might respond to this by observing that medicine is not, strictly speaking, a science. Rather, it's an applied field that combines biological science with psychological and social notions of highly variable rigor. And it's from this latter side that politics has entered and has taken precedence over truth. So it's fair to ask, are there any examples of similar politicization corrupting physics, chemistry, or biology? Now, in Galileo's time, physics and astronomy were subjects of political and theological dispute. But for the past 2 centuries, it's been principally biology on the firing line. For a long time, religious conservatives were loath to accept the fact that biological species, including humans, have evolved over time, much less to accept Darwin's explanation of that evolution by natural and sexual selection. Those anti-evolution views continue to be strong in the USA, as well as in some parts of the Muslim world, and the resulting political pressure distorts the teaching of biology in the public schools. But the effect on research and teaching in the universities is minimal, I think. Nowadays, the pressure on research and university-level teaching in biology comes principally from the left, and I use the quotation marks advisedly. And until recently, it concerned mainly the investigation of statistical differences in human traits, especially psychological traits, by sex or geographical ancestry, that is to say, race, whatever that means. But now, even mentioning sex as a biological fact can elicit a Twitter storm of condemnation, or I guess I have to say an X storm. And the main victims, not surprisingly, are researchers with untenured, precarious contracts. Superstars like Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker are too big to be canceled. Campaigns against them are intended as a warning to others. So, for example, Harvard biologist Carol Hooven, a much praised but untenured lecturer in human evolutionary biology at Harvard and author of an acclaimed book on testosterone, got herself into hot water when she dared to say on national television that, quote, "The facts are that there are two sexes, male and female, and those sexes are designated by the kinds of gametes we produced." Now, she stressed that, quote, "We can treat people with respect and respect their gender identities and use their preferred pronouns. So understanding the facts about biology doesn't prevent us from treating people with respect." She used the word respect 3 times in one sentence. This didn't stop. Sorry, let me get some water. This didn't stop the graduate student director of her department's Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Task Force from lambasting her remarks on Twitter, of course, as transphobic and harmful. To make a long story short, and it is a very long story, and you can read the article that she wrote, and there are articles that other people have written too about this. To make a long story short, Harvard's administrators failed to defend Hooven's reputation or even her academic freedom. They issued the usually weaselly 2-sided statements, and 18 months later, Hooven resigned. A similar fate befell Penn State biologist Colin Wright. He was only a postdoc, who dared to author an article arguing that the observed statistical sex differences in human behavior are probably, at least in part, grounded in evolution, and that, even more shockingly, it seems, there are 2 sexes, male and female, and over 99.98% of all humans belong unambiguously to one or the other. To make matters worse, Wright later co-authored an essay entitled, quote, "No one is born in the wrong body." Shortly thereafter, at the height of the academic recruitment season, somebody posted a listing on the major ecology and evolution job board. Here was the job listing. Colin Wright is a transphobe who supports race science. And I'm again shortening the story very much. You'll have to read Colin's article. The activists, possibly a very small but loud group, were explicit in their attempts to intimidate any university foolhardy enough to offer Wright a job. 2 months later, he quit academia. He recounted the details of the story in an article shrewdly titled, "Think cancel culture doesn't exist? My own lived experience says otherwise." But as Hooven and Wright are at pains to emphasize, the harm arising from this politicization of scientific inquiry is not just, or even primarily, the manifest injustice done to researchers like themselves. Rather, the principal harm is done to the scientific endeavor itself by inducing researchers to self-censor as a matter of personal and professional preservation. Cancel culture undermines the freedom of debate that is the cornerstone of the scientific community's claims to knowledge. And I'm going to come back to that, but let me just now quote John Stuart Mill, as he pointed out a century and a half ago in his famous essay on liberty. At one point, he gives, a little bit surprisingly, the example of Newtonian mechanics in physics. And he says, The beliefs which we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. If the challenge is not accepted, or is accepted and the attempt fails, we are far enough from certainty still, but we've done the best that the existing state of human reason admits of. This is the amount of certainty attainable by a fallible being, and this the sole way of attaining it. When that freedom of debate is curtailed, even true ideas, like Newtonian mechanics, stop being rationally justified. And I'm going to come back to that towards the end of my talk. Okay, in the physical sciences, by contrast with the biological sciences, I think the main attacks on the freedom of research have come from right-wing politicians attacking climate science and environmental science and attempting to defund them. This threat seems to have receded somewhat in recent years, as conservative politicians have mostly retreated from questioning anthropogenic global warming and have focused instead on the allegedly excessive cost of transition to a non-carbon economy. But it could resurge if Donald Trump wins the next American election. There's also some pressure on the physical sciences and mathematics from the, let me again put in quotation marks, woke left. But at present, it's mainly concerned not with the content of research, but with vague calls for decolonization of curricula and for decentering whiteness and cis heteropatriarchy in pedagogy. Now, it's tolerably clear what decolonization could mean in history and literature, but it's less clear what it might entail in the natural sciences and mathematics, which purport to produce, and in my view do often produce, universally valid knowledge. However, some advocates of decolonization, not all, some, take the radical position that scientific and mathematical knowledge is not, in fact, universally valid. And in New Zealand, this postmodernist idea has now become official policy. The national curriculum explicitly mandates, quote, equal status for Maturanga Maori, that means Maori knowledge, asserting that it has, quote, equal value with other bodies of knowledge, presumably including modern science. Indeed, the chemistry curriculum was revised to include the concept of Maori, which is defined as the binding force between the physical and the spiritual, that students are taught is present in all matter. Well, one chemist perceptively commented, who discovered this binding force between the physical and the spiritual? And what evidence was involved in its discovery? If this binding force is real, then everyone needs to know about it. It needs to be in the chemistry syllabus of every country, not just New Zealand. Actually, it now appears that the inclusion of Maori in the chemistry curriculum was quietly rolled back after protests from scientists. Other advocates of decolonization accept the universality of scientific knowledge, but simply urge greater attention in teaching to the non-Western origins of much mathematics and science. Now, that's a very sensible suggestion. For example, every mathematician knows that the concept of zero as a number arose in India in the 5th century CE, and that algebra, I mean, the word algebra is an Arabic word, right? The algebra was developed by Islamic scholars starting around 800 CE before being elaborated in Renaissance Europe. So mathematicians know that. Students deserve to know that too. But the main focus of science and mathematics teaching, I think, has to be on our subject, in which we lecturers can rightly claim some expertise, not on its history, in which most of us are rank amateurs. Students who want to pursue the history of science should learn it from professional historians of science, learning how to think like historians and how to critique theories such as decoloniality rather than simply accepting them as fact, as one critic put it. One final aspect of decolonization is the proposal to rename the contributions of scientists whose behavior is now considered to be morally lacking or whose extra scientific ideas are now considered to be offensive. So that includes, among others, Isaac Newton, who allegedly benefited from colonialism. It's not clear whether that's true, but that was alleged. Fritz Haber, who developed chemical weapons, and William Shockley, who, as you know, was quite extreme racist and eugenicist, among many others. The downsides of these cancellations done in the name of moral purity were eloquently explained in a recent article by the chemist Anna Krylov. And she pointed out in earlier epochs who were the victims. Well, there was Marie Curie, who had an affair with a married man, and Alan Turing, who was gay. Okay, what about decentering whiteness and cis heteropatriarchy in teaching? Well, there was one article on dismantling whiteness in physics teaching, was published recently in the journal Physical Review Physics Education Research. So this is the section of the prestigious Physical Review devoted to, quote, experimental and theoretical research relating to the teaching and learning of physics and astronomy. Now, I won't enter into the details of the article. You can read it for yourselves. But more interesting is what happened when 4 physicists took up the editor's invitation to contribute constructive and respectful criticism of published articles, referring specifically to this one, in the form of comments. So the 4 authors duly submitted a comment. It was rejected by the journal's editor on the ground that, quote, it was framed from the perspective of a research paradigm that is different from the one of the research being critiqued. So as the authors dryly but accurately pointed out, this is akin to stating that an astronomer must first accept astrology as true before critiquing it. Such notions should be, at a minimum, dispiriting for anyone who sees educational practices as worthy of empirical investigation. Okay. So far, I have to say those corruptions in the physical sciences are still marginal. But I'd like to give one more example of politicization arising from within the scientific community that I believe should raise great concern. 2 years ago, the prestigious journal Nature issued a new ethics guidance concerning proposed submissions. But the guidance isn't about the protection of human research subjects. That issue has been strictly regulated for decades. Nor is it about restricting the publication of information that poses serious material dangers, such as facilitating the production of nuclear or biological weapons. Rather, the guidance purports to address other forms of harm that could be caused by a scientific publication. And on these grounds, the editors arrogate to themselves an astoundingly broad power. And I'll quote from their policy. Regardless of content type, research, review, or opinion, and for research, regardless of whether a research project was reviewed and approved by an appropriate institutional ethics committee, editors reserve the right to request modifications to, or correct or otherwise amend post-publication, and in severe cases refuse publication of, or retract post-publication. Okay, that's the end of the lawyer-like stuff. Here's the kicker of what they propose to censor. Quote, content that undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or human group on the basis of socially constructed or socially relevant human groupings. Now that vague and subjective language is an open door to ideological censorship of valid scientific contributions, a censorship that the editors do not even attempt to disguise. So I'd like to evaluate critically the justifications that the editors of Nature have offered in support of this brave new policy. Now, the document starts ominously, quote, although academic freedom is fundamental, it is not unbounded. Vague assertions of this kind are always a bad sign. One knows what's coming next. The guidance purports to apply ethical principles analogous to those used to protect human research subjects, but now concerning other types of harms. Quote, for example, research may, inadvertently, stigmatize individuals or human groups. It may be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic. It may provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups simply because of their social characteristics. So I'd like to slowly unpack these claims. First, what could it mean for scientific research to stigmatize individuals or human groups, and to do so inadvertently? Suppose research finds that obesity can cause cancer. It can. Does that stigmatize overweight people? Well, some people would argue that it does, but that's shooting the messenger because we don't like the message. In fact, suppressing this research would do harm above all to overweight people by denying them information that they could use if they wish, and only if they wish, to protect their health. Or suppose research finds that gay men have more sexual partners on average than heterosexual men. They do. Does that stigmatize gay men? Well, maybe it does, at least in the eyes of people who disdain sexual promiscuity. But it's also important information in planning interventions to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted disease, interventions that would disproportionately benefit gay men. The editors of Nature have thus assigned to themselves the purely subjective task of judging which scientific research stigmatizes some social group, and have empowered themselves to suppress valid scientific contributions, that is, information that's likely to be true and important, on that sole basis. Okay, secondly, what could it mean for scientific research to be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic? If the research incorporated racist or sexist presuppositions, that would be an epistemic defect that would undermine the quality of the research and perhaps invalidate it entirely, purely on traditional scientific criteria. No new ethics guidance is needed on that score. Clearly, what the editors are getting at is not racist or sexist presuppositions, but rather conclusions from the research that the editors, in their infinite wisdom, judge to be racist or sexist. But that is again shooting the messenger. Suppose, for instance, that research finds, as indeed it seems to, that men show larger variation than women over a range of cognitive and psychological traits, including various types of intelligence, so that men are overrepresented at both the low and high ends of the scale, even when the means are equal. Now, surely this is not the only reason why women are underrepresented among scientists. Sexist stereotypes influencing girls and young women must also be a major contributing factor, and there are undoubtedly other factors as well. But it might form part of the explanation. It might mean that even in a future non-sexist society, the majority of scientists, and also of people with intellectual disabilities, will be men. Should this information be suppressed? If that happens, then our ignorance of relevant facts will interfere with our ability to determine accurately the extent to which sexist discrimination persists in different fields, and will also impede us from distinguishing between ameliorative policies that are effective and those that are not. And what finally can it mean to, quote, provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups? Consider again the research about sex differences in the variation of mathematical ability. Would this research provide a justification for discriminating against women scientists? Absolutely not. It might provide a lame excuse for such discrimination, but not a justification. Since each individual's work can be evaluated on its own merits, the statistical properties of the groups to which that individual belongs are completely irrelevant. So what the editors seem to have in mind is not research that could justify undermining the human rights of specific groups. Indeed, it's hard to see how any scientific research could do that, simply because one cannot derive an ought from an is, but rather research that some people might attempt to misuse as a supposed justification for undermining human rights. But valid ideas shouldn't be suppressed because some people might misuse them. Rather, it's the misuse that should be criticized instead. So the bottom line is that the editors of Nature have arrogated to themselves the right to suppress valid scientific work that's both correct and important, purely because it allegedly undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or human group. But what could it mean for a scientific contribution, that is, information about reality, to undermine anyone's rights or dignities? Once again, the editors are perpetrating a severe confusion between is and ought, and indeed the policy is entirely founded on that confusion. But then the editors cover their tracks by introducing, in astute lawyer-like fashion, a new element. The scientific work need not actually undermine anyone's rights or dignities. Rather, it suffices that some unnamed people, you notice the editor's strategic use of the passive voice, that some unnamed people could reasonably perceive the work to undermine someone's rights or dignities. But this is an extraordinarily broad criterion. It's likely that any controversial scientific work that has public policy implications will cause some people to perceive it as undermining someone's rights or dignities. For example, and this is not a contrived example, this is an actual example, an article reviewing the neuropsychological effects of puberty blockers will likely be labeled by advocates of gender identity ideology as undermining the rights and dignities of transgender people. And in fact, one of this article's anonymous peer reviewers did say that it stigmatized an already stigmatized group. Others will reply that this research helps to protect the rights of gender nonconforming teenagers by offering them accurate information about the benefits and risks of proposed medical interventions. Now, admittedly, the editors require that the research slated for suppression could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or group. But who gets to decide which perceptions are reasonable and which are not? The editors themselves, of course. And these are the same editors who insist, among other things, that sex as defined by gametes and chromosomes has no foundation in science, that I'm quoting them, that sex is more complex than male and female, and that the now outdated, according to them, biological view would undermine efforts to reduce discrimination against transgender people and those who do not fall into the binary categories of male and female, unquote. Consequently, any scientific article that employs the standard biological concept of sex now risks being characterized by the Nature editors as undermining the risks and dignities of transgender people, and ipso facto as being reasonably perceived as doing so. But since that criterion would exclude a huge chunk of work in biology and medicine, the editors can't apply it consistently without sabotaging their own journal. So they will of necessity apply it selectively to suppress those studies whose conclusions they dislike. As psychologist Bo Weingart perceptively pointed out, let me quote, "Imagine for a moment that this editorial were written not by political progressives, but by conservative Catholics, who announced that any research promoting, even inadvertently, promiscuous sex, the breakdown of the nuclear family, agnosticism and atheism, or the decline of the nation state would be suppressed or rejected, lest it inflict unspecified harm on vaguely defined groups or individuals. Many of those presently nodding along with Nature's editors would have no difficulty identifying the subordination of science to a political agenda in that case." Now, the Nature editors do attempt to soften the blow of their brazen announcement of future censorship by declaring that, quote, "There is a fine balance between academic freedom and the protection of the dignity and rights of individuals and human groups. We commit to using this guidance cautiously and judiciously, consulting with ethics experts and advocacy groups where needed." As Weinberg comments, this is not at all reassuring. Asking ethicists to assess the wisdom of publishing a scientific journal article is as antithetical to the spirit of science as soliciting publication advice from a religious scholar. Who are these ethics experts and advocacy groups anyway? Imagine the outcry on the left if a journal announced that it would be consulting pro-life advocates before publishing an article about the effects of abortion on well-being, or if it decided to consult conservative evangelicals when evaluating an article about the effects of adoption by homosexual couples. Okay, there's one further danger that the advocates of ideological censorship in science would do well, I think, to ponder. And now let me go back to John Stuart Mill. As he observed in his celebrated essay on liberty, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Now, I think the first side of this bifurcation is clear. We all naturally think that our current opinions are correct, otherwise they wouldn't be our opinions. But we still ought to be willing to admit that we're not infallible. And that means if you really care about truth, that you ought to be open to hearing arguments against your current opinions and open to changing those opinions whenever the counter-arguments turn out to be cogent. Now, perhaps the Nature editors are so utterly certain that their views on a huge variety of disparate subjects are all 100% correct that they're unable to imagine learning even a tiny bit from listening to reasoned criticisms. Well, if that's the case, then they themselves are the losers, as well as their readers who are prevented from hearing relevant evidence. But the other side of Mill's bifurcations is less obvious, so let me quote him again. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them, and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. That's not the way to do justice to the arguments or bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest, and do their very utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. 99 in 100 of what are called educated men are in this condition, even of those who can argue fluently for their opinions. Their conclusion may be true, but it might be false for anything they know. They've never thrown themselves into the mental position of those who think differently from them and considered what such persons may have to say. And consequently, they do not, in any proper sense of the word, know the doctrine that they themselves profess. And Mill's two-pronged argument in favor of the freedom of debate is in fact a crucial ingredient in legitimizing knowledge in general and scientific knowledge in particular. And as I mentioned earlier, it's striking that Mill himself used an example from science, namely Newtonian mechanics, to explain why. Isaac Newton published his celebrated laws of motion in 1687, and by the time Mill was writing in 1859, scientists had accumulated overwhelming evidence from both terrestrial and astronomical observations that Newtonian physics is correct, even to the point of predicting accurately in 1846 the existence and precise location of the hitherto unknown planet Neptune. I mean, it's really quite an amazing feat of science. But Mill points out, if at some point the government or even just the scientific societies had decided that in view of the overwhelming evidence of the correctness of Newtonian mechanics, it would henceforth be forbidden to dispute it, then we would now have much less reason to believe in the correctness of Newtonian mechanics. It's precisely the fact that Newtonian mechanics is held up in the face of free and open debate that gives us justified confidence in its correctness. There's also an added twist in the story, which illustrates the first side of Mill's argument, though unfortunately Mill didn't live to see it. It turns out that Newtonian mechanics is not correct. It's an extremely accurate approximation in many circumstances, but it's not correct. This was discovered in 1905 by Albert Einstein, more than 30 years after Mill's death. But this important fact might never have been discovered, or at the very least, its discovery would have been delayed if criticism of Newton's theory had been forbidden. So even if the progressives, put that in quotation marks, are 100% correct on every subject and have nothing whatsoever to learn from their thoughtful critics, censorship of opposing views is still harmful to their own cause, as it undermines the good reasons for anyone else to adopt their ideas. I think it would be a real positive step if the Nature editors were to reflect on this argument, which is, after all, Mill's, not mine, and respond to it. But people with power are unfortunately not accustomed to acknowledging, much less addressing, reasoned critiques from lesser mortals, so don't hold your breath. Anyway, the time is not so bad. Anyway, I've probably gone on for too long. So let me thank you all for your patience in sitting through this long diatribe and open the floor to all the comments and criticisms that you care to throw at me. So I don't know, who's going to moderate the questions? Okay, then why don't you come up? Questions don't have to be questions. Questions can be diatribes as long as they're short.
Got questions or comments.
As I hope you can be clear from my talk, I want to hear people who disagree with me. Yeah.
So just from a quick pushback on the argument.
I'm sorry, on.
Back on the Mill's argument.
Yeah, sure.
Free speech as a free market. I mean, like, one issue is that people don't always come with the market without pre-existing beliefs and purposes, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
People don't always come into the market of ideas without prior purposes and prior beliefs. So it's very likely that if the market are full of people who already have prior beliefs and prior ideas, and when they react to this kind of new information that got pumped out, they won't always rationally apply it, right? So the concern will be that, yes, so right, like, let's just run through the fact that, rationally speaking, a study about how potential, genetic differences among humans' potential abilities can be used to help solve the issue. But because people don't already come with this kind of like, blank state ideas of like what is correct, what is wrong, it might actually be people misuse the science. And then I think there's a trade-off between whether or not we should allow the possibility of people misusing it and then for an actual argument of that versus like the possibility of like using it correctly and like things like that.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a fair point. Let me first say, I hate this metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, right? I mean, it's not a market, it's not a free market. I mean, we don't all have equal, opportunity to be heard. I mean, and yes, you're right that it may be that a true idea will be misused by more people than correctly used. But I mean, I would argue that still it's better for the idea to be out there, and then we can fight against the misusers rather than suppressing the idea. And then, of course, there's the issue that all advocates of censorship have to think through: who are going to be the censors? Every person who's in favor of some kind of censorship imagines themselves as the censor. But of course, it doesn't work out that way. It works out that somebody has to be the censor, and very, very often, the advocates of censorship end up being censored themselves when their political opponents come to power. And so the advocates of censorship have to somehow argue that the people who actually have the power to impose the censorship are wiser than the people who are being censored. And that's always far from clear.
I think it's important to separate science and policy. That the science will be for truth seeking. Then, the policymakers can discuss and debate and then discuss the ethics of what we do with that.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I tried to make that at the beginning, and I do want to stress that. In fact, I would suggest a very good statement of that is there's a French group called the Association Française pour l'Information Scientifique. It's a French Association for Scientific Information, AFIS. So you can go to their website, and if you want, you can go to Google Translate if you don't speak French. And they have a very, very clear explanation of that. They say science is about finding reality that helps to illuminate public policy. It does not determine public policy. Public policy is determined by democratic debate using the inputs from science. But of course, other things come in like values, and they make very clear that that second stage is outside the ambit of their association. And so I think that's a very, very important point. And I should say, it's very important, especially for scientists who work in fields that have public policy implications, for example, climate science, to be very, very clear about what hat they're wearing when, right? I mean, it's understandable that people who work in climate science, who understand better than the rest of us what's going on and the dangers, will also become advocates for public policies to deal with it. And that's perfectly fair. But I think they have to be very, very clear about what hat they're wearing at any given time. When are they speaking as scientists about the scientific facts? When are they speaking as citizens about what public policies they think should be implemented? Because if they don't make a clear distinction like that, what's going to happen, unfortunately, is that people who disagree with them about public policy, possibly for good reasons, will start distrusting their scientific contributions, and will start not just will, has had the effect of undermining public trust in the validity of climate science.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned some syndrome that's like 1 out of 1,000.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a. I'll read it again. I mean, look, I just got this from looking at Wikipedia. But I mean, some people have disputed. I mean, I'm taking when I said that de la Chapelle syndrome, that 0.003%, and Swire syndrome, 0.0005%. I said they arguably fall outside the standard male-female classification. Other people say, no, they don't. So, but I'm taking a broad, I'm allowing. So one of these two is somebody who has XX chromosomes, but nevertheless develops viable male organs, or the other way around. But as I said, even if you grant that those fall outside the standard male-female classification, it's less than 0.02%. So for all practical purposes, it's binary. Now, that doesn't mean we should forget about those, I mean, 0.2%. I mean, they deserve to be treated fairly, but what it does mean is we shouldn't pretend that there are more than two sexes, and we shouldn't pretend that sex is assigned at birth. It isn't. It's determined at conception.
So, sorry to agree with you. I reject the idea of a clean separation between science and policy, insofar as these feel, at least in the social environment that we have today, these are invariably linked to one another and almost cyclic, where science informs policy, which then chooses what science gets funded and researched. So in light of that, I completely agree that I don't think it is the role of the editorial board at Nature to be determining what groups could be harmed under what circumstances by some research and then make censorious decisions on that basis. It does feel that in light of how science will invariably affect policy and vice versa, there are some decisions that need to be made about what science is worth pursuing and worth publishing on that basis. And I guess, do you feel that that obligation falls onto the individual researcher? If you know that your research is going to be used to carry out some horrific crimes against humanity, I would say that that researcher probably does have an obligation to not pursue that. If you know that your research on, so you brought up like the greater male variability hypothesis, for example. If you know that that is going to be used by, perhaps even if they go against your morals, you believe with some conviction that's likely to be used by extremely sexist and chauvinistic people to perhaps redirect women away from the natural sciences. What obligation do you have as a researcher, if any, to perhaps avoid pursuing or publishing that research? And if that obligation doesn't fall onto the individual, who does it fall onto to make for a better world?
Yeah, a good question. So you raised several points. So let me go back. So the issue about the funding, as I said at the beginning, I think it's perfectly legitimate that social and political ideas and values will help to determine which scientific investigations are important to pursue. The only thing I wanted to separate from that is those should not affect which results get published, right? I wanted to separate what research is you choose or society chooses to pursue versus do you evaluate the evidence accurately and without bias. So that's my answer to the first question. Yeah.
That at the level of a journal editorial staff? Do you mean that at the level of, there's a long research has just created ex nihilo. There's a long chain of causal reasoning between research starting and a result being published.
Yeah, no, what I mean is at the level of, reviewers and journal editors, they should be asking themselves, is this good science? Not, do I like the results, right? So your second question about research that can potentially be misused, for example, as you said, the greater male variability hypothesis can be misused by sexists. Yes, you can. I think every individual scientist has a perfect right to worry about this, and every individual scientist has a perfect right to decide what to work on or not to work on. And so if a particular scientist is worried that a particular research is very likely to be misused, then, if they decide they don't want to do that, that's fine. I don't think that other people should be forced, however, not to work on that. So for example, the greater male variability hypothesis, I think it's pretty easy to refute people who try to use it for sexist purposes. I did it in one sentence, right? I mean, you can judge each individual based on their merits, and there's no reason to push women away from science, right? You let each person, male or female, do whatever their interests and talents lead them to do, and you judge their work based on its merits. That's that. So that's an example, I think, of a misuse that's very easy to refute. Now, I agree with the comment made in the back that just because something is easy to refute rationally doesn't mean that in the real world the refutation will win. You know, I don't know whether it's going to win about immigrants eating cats in Ohio. But somehow I have to put my bets on putting the ideas out there and use, if the science is valid, put it out there, use it for the things that it can be used for, and refute the misuses. That anyway is, you know, my personal attitude. Of course, there's one more extreme version of what you said. Some kinds of research can, of course, lead to material dangers, right? People who work in virology, in nuclear physics, and so on, have to worry about that. And those kinds of decisions, I could imagine, could be made at a social level. I could imagine that there could be government regulation of what kind of, you know, what kinds of the genetic modification of viruses are allowed to be done.
So behind.
Actually, I was wondering on this question about machine learning. You see, nuclear physics, yeah, it's like imminent, possibly dangerous, but like there's always debate about should we slow down machine learning research? But maybe you could share some examples.
Oh, I'm afraid I don't know enough about that to have a good opinion. I mean, of course, I'm scared. Well, I had some experiences with ChatGPT, actually. The first experience I had, someone emailed me the result. They asked ChatGPT, pretend you're Alan Sokal, write about your hoax 20 years later. What have you learned from it? And what ChatGPT wrote was very plausible, but totally wrong about what I actually think, but plausible, right? I tried again with ChatGPT. I asked, tell me about the Janocki numbers. The Janocki numbers are a sequence of integers that come up in enumerative combinatorics, and my PhD student and I had written an article about them, right? So I asked ChatGPT, tell me about the Janocki numbers. ChatGPT gave me the correct history and then gave me a totally wrong formula for them. And I said, you know how you can chat with ChatGPT. I said, but that formula is wrong. And ChatGPT gave me its standard answer. I'm sorry, I only know what I was trained on. And then I asked ChatGPT, please tell me the first 10 Janocki numbers. Gave me the numbers. I was amazed. But I hadn't memorized them all, right? I mean, I don't know, 1, 3, 17, 55, and I can't remember what they are. It got the first 6, so I had to look them up, right? It got the first 6 correct, and the rest were total bullshit. They kind of went up at roughly the right rate. ChatGPT had correctly guessed that they're all odd. But other than that, they were total bullshit. And I realized that ChatGPT is like a moderately good student that you give an oral exam to. And what do? When they know the answer, they'll tell it to you. And when they don't know the answer, they're really good at bullshitting. And unless you know the subject really well, you won't be able to distinguish a good answer from bullshit. And that worries me a lot, especially because you know, these things are going to get better. They're going to get better at bullshitting. They may get better at being accurate, but we're not sure if that's going to happen. But beyond that, let me not talk because I'm not an expert on it. But of course, I'm worried.
So let's try and
Yeah, sorry, I went on too long. And we can go on till midnight anyway, right?
Thank you so much for the talk.
Yeah.
So, question is relating to the gender or the sex binary, and then this question of whether it's assigned at birth or
Yeah.
observed at birth.
Right.
Hypotheses, right? like you could say that sex takes 3 or more values, but it's still something that's observed at birth. It's
Right. Right. Right.
The claim that it's something that's assigned at birth, or do you object independently or maybe more or less so to this idea that it's a binary or not? Because it seems like when you say that like some proportion of the population does not take either of these two values, sure, those proportions are quite small, as you noted, but that still seems like a genuine discovery, right? Like scientists discovered something, we see that people can take on different chromosomal patterns, etc. So I'm curious, what do we really like think of the truth conditions are for the statement, like sex is binary? Is it just that there's these two types of gametes produced? But then we've also talked about chromosomal identification. So what do we, is that just a proxy for gamete production when we see XXY or something like that? Because if you really just object to the assigned versus determined at birth, or the assigned versus, you know, predetermined observed, it seems like you can get that without having to say that sex is or isn't binary.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm making both claims, but you're right to distinguish them. I mean, the most important one that is, of course, that this is an objective biological reality, not something that's simply assigned at birth. That's the most important. And that's why I went back 30 years to discuss social constructivism about quarks, because this is like that, but much crazier, right? It's much more plausible that quarks are socially constructed than it is that sex is socially constructed. I mean, neither one is true, but the quarks are more subtle. About the binary, I mean, of course, I don't say that it's binary. I say that it's almost binary, right? I mean, we can debate about whether the almost is 0.02% or less. Some people, I mean, again, you know, you can define things in different ways. So if you take a very, very broad definition of what used to be called intersex and is now called DSDs, then you can get up to 1% or so. But that's really throwing together a lot of people who have a perfectly well-defined sex and just have somewhat anomalous genital organs. So look, I'm not a biologist, right? So I'm perfectly happy to admit that there are different ways that you can define sex that almost perfectly, but not perfectly overlap. You can define it by what gametes you can produce. Well, of course, not what gametes you can produce, because lots of people are infertile, but what gametes you have organs that ought to be able to produce, you know. Or you can define it by chromosomes, and these things do not perfectly overlap. And that's why I was willing to grant the 0.0005% of the XXs who have functional male genitals, even though some of my biologist friends say, no, they're male.
Okay, we have more, I think, one here.
Thank you, Professor, for such a illuminating talk. And a couple of quick comments, something related to the content you mentioned, also the question. My husband works in medicine, and then sometimes he takes his dictation home to do like dictation into the medical record. And recently, I was really shocked to find out one of the top fields for individual patient's record. First is gender, and you select male, female, and non-binary. And next to that is preferred pronoun. So the patient has a field that you have to fill in, preferred pronoun. And there are already cases that nurses got reprimanded for misgendering patient. And then I asked my husband, so, well, what do you think of it? He said, I don't care because we're too tired to care, too tired to fight. So that's the reality we live in. But obviously, so that especially the gender pronoun field, I think personally it's an introduction of like extra opportunity for medical error. So and what if your appearance doesn't necessarily conform with your preferred pronoun? So I'm not sure what's going to happen. So in the practice in the surgery.
Let me ask a question. So there was a field for gender identity and a field for preferred pronouns. Was there also a field for sex?
It's called.
So, see, because that to me is the problem. In medicine of all places, the doctor needs to know the sex of the patient. There was a horrible case of a trans man who arrived in the hospital with severe abdominal pain, and there are various diagnoses. They were eventually sent home. Well, it turns out that he or she, whatever you want to call, was pregnant, and basically miscarried because of the misdiagnosis, because the doctors, somehow, I think the person had said they were a trans man, but the record didn't show it. So they were treating this person as a male with abdominal pain when in fact it was a pregnant woman. So in medicine, of all places, what you need to know, first of all, is the person's sex. Okay, now I don't object to the doctor also knowing the person's gender identity if they have one, and their preferred pronouns if they have them, because medicine is also a social and psychological field, and the doctor has to, properly address the patient. That's fair enough. But there should be a field in the record that says sex.
As a parent who have children in secondary education, and there's a lot of gender fluidity education being introduced starting kindergarten. So there's a lot of controversy and debate around it. And here's my question. So what do you think are the end goals of such ideological and political forces that are pushing this, either in secondary or post-secondary education, or in the general scientific field?
Right.
So the phenomenon that you just described.
Right. Well, this is a long story, and so I should say, you should note that in what I said, I didn't mention the word gender identity, right? It's a whole, I only wanted to talk about biological sex, and is it something that's an objective biological reality, or is it something that's assigned at birth? Now, of course, this is related to the whole debate about transgender people and the whole question of what gender identity means. I have my views about it, but I wanted to keep them out of this talk because that's a much more complicated debate, right? And I think it's really important that the two debates be kept separate. Unfortunately, so a lot of what I said about sex assigned at birth comes from an article that Richard Dawkins and I wrote that we published about 6 months ago in the Boston Globe. Well, I should say, it was first submitted to the New York Times. They rejected it. It was then submitted to the Washington Post. They rejected it. And then the Boston Globe dared to publish it. And in that article, we talked about sex, not gender identity. Unfortunately, the editor in the headline said sex and gender. And I think it's important to keep these debates separate, because one thing is to talk about what does biological sex mean? And I think that's a pretty easy thing to answer. The other is, what is meant by gender identity, and how should it be taken into account socially? That's a much more complicated debate, which, as I say, I have my views about, but maybe we can discuss them over drinks.
Last question that we have time for, and after that, anybody who wants to stick around and come up to Alan and chat. I just want to give a brief thanks to our sponsors. First and foremost, the philosophy department got us this room and publicized the event. The math department also, the Government and Politics Association, which is an undergraduate group, the Penn Alumni Free Speech Alliance, and the Heterodox Academy that published it on their website, and it's going to archive the video. So quick thanks to those sponsors, and if you still have something to say for the last.
Yes. I would like to push back on the issues of the sex, right? But I think it's illustrate the more general point. Is that I think during history of science and mathematics, a lot of time definition change, right? Because the new definition might be more useful. For example, we have this whole controversy with Pluto being no longer considered a planet, right?
And of course, like in math, like the word group and manifold have changed the definition over time. So, for me, like I think there's a distinction between changing definition but keep the reality and trying to change reality. But so when it comes to the issues of sex, like from what I understand is that even though sex used to be defined by chromosome, due to the new understanding of medicine, like the whole money, the whole experience by Dr. Money, they define a new word gender just to refer to the neurological property that is hard to detect when you use X-ray or any other form of physical detection, but it seems to be real, and it's kind of similar to many other psychological condition that is also sometimes very hard to detect, physically, but only through interaction with the patient or the person. So I guess my question is, what's your view on changing definition and reducing, say, a previous word to refer to something else? And would that be considered a form of censorship, or is that like?
Well, I think we can, I mean, the mathematician's point of view is this. You can define a word to mean anything you want, provided you're clear about what it means and you don't confuse it with other things. And so let me give an example. The word parent used to mean a biological parent. Now, more often, it means a social or legal parent, and we say the word biological parent when that's what we mean, right? So the word, and that's important to me because I'm an adoptive parent, and I would be incensed if someone were to say, I'm not a real parent, right? But the point is we can still be clear about what we mean. We now, when we say parent, we mean a social or legal parent, but we can still refer to the concept of biological parent by saying biological parent. In the past, we would have done it the other way around. That's perfectly legitimate as long as we're all agreed about what the words mean and we don't get confused. The debates now, unfortunately, I mean, I don't want to get into this gender identity, which will take hours, but for example, there have been proposals to redefine the word woman, right? I mean, woman traditionally means adult human female, and there are now proposals to redefine it to mean anyone who considers themselves to be a woman, regardless of whether they are or not an adult human female. And there's a long story about whether that even makes any sense. And I wrote a short article about that. But let's not get into that. The point I think is that fights about language should not conceal discussions about real things, right? We should not try to win policy arguments by deceiving people by redefining old words with new meanings. We should be clear about what we mean. We should use words in a way that everybody knows what we're talking about, and then we can debate the real issues, whatever they are.